care or Social Security, and including their children's child care. So now we have a system that really is
I'm going to leave this now. You can watch the rest of it online, cspan.org. Take you live to the floor of the House.
To suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2166 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2166, a bill to direct the Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of Agriculture to expedite access to certain federal lands under the administrative jurisdiction of each Secretary for Good Samaritan search and recovery missions and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis, and the gentleman from Arizona, Ms. Rabalva, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
In the Natural Resources Committee, we heard testimony from Jody Goldberg, who shared a story about the search for her brother Keith, who had been murdered and whose body was presumed to be in the vicinity of the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. A nonprofit search and rescue team attempted to search within the recreation area but was delayed by the National Park Service for over a year. By the time the search and recovery team was allowed access to search for Mr. Goldberg's remains, they were found in a matter of hours. The bureaucratic delays and roadblocks constructed by the National Park Service are at best unnecessary, but much worse than that, they have caused undue suffering to families that simply want to look for their loved ones. This bipartisan bill makes perfect sense. The Good Samaritan Search and Recovery Act, sponsored by Congressman Joe Heck, would require the federal land management agencies to quickly issue permits to qualify search and recovery groups. This would also eliminate the requirement to obtain costly insurance provided they waive liability against the federal government. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense legislation, and Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On January 2012, when Keith Goldberg went missing, finding him was all his family wanted. Investigators presumed that he had been murdered and his remains were somewhere in the Lake Mead National Recreation Area, a unit administered by the National Park Service. After several months passed, local law enforcement was unable to recover Mr. Goldberg's remains, and they gave up the search. His family, wanting what any family would want, reached out to a private, nonprofit search and rescue outfit for assistance. Unfortunately, it took 15 months for a professional search and rescue company to acquire the permits and insurance to conduct the search. However, within 2 hours of receiving the necessary credentials, Mr. Goldberg's body was recovered. H.R. 2166 will help speed up the process for granting private Good Samaritan search and rescue companies access to federal lands. The bill strikes a fair balance between guaranteeing safety and sufficient liability insurance for the American taxpayer and improving the process. H.R. 2166, private search and rescue operations, when appropriate, should have and can have timely access to public lands under H.R. 2166. We support the legislation, urge its adoption, and reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, the sponsor of the bill, Dr. Heck.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee, as well as the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona and the gentleman from Utah, for working with me in a bipartisan manner to bring H.R. 2166, the Good Samaritan Search and Recovery Act, to the floor. H.R. 2166 tears down the bureaucratic roadblocks that are preventing families from receiving closure when their loved ones go missing on federal land. This issue was first brought to my attention by the separate but similarly tragic cases of Las Vegas taxi driver Keith Goldberg and Air Force Staff Sergeant Antonio Tucker. Mr. Goldberg and Staff Sergeant Tucker were presumed dead, and the remains were believed to be missing somewhere within the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. In both cases, local, experienced search and recovery groups volunteered their time and resources to help locate the remains of these missing individuals. Unfortunately, due to unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles from the federal government, the group volunteering to help locate and recover Mr. Goldberg's remains were denied access to Park Service land for over 15 months. The group volunteering to help locate the remains of Staff Sergeant Tucker was denied access for 10 months, needlessly delaying the closure both families deserved. These stories are heart-wrenching, these actions are unacceptable, and they must change. Once these bureaucratic hurdles were finally cleared and these Good Samaritan search and recovery groups were allowed access to Park Service land, Mr. Goldberg's remains were recovered in less than 2 hours, and the remains of Staff Sergeant Tucker were recovered in less than 2 days. As a former member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Search and Rescue Team, I introduced this bill because unnecessary red tape simply must not continue to get in the way of providing closure for families faced with tragic circumstances. After a hearing, this bill passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee with a unanimous vote showing real bipartisan support for the measure. I ask my colleagues to pass this bill so that other families won't have to needlessly suffer the way the families of Keith Goldberg and Antonio Tucker did. Again, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member of the full committee and the subcommittee for working diligently to bring this bill to the floor. I urge its passage and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me acknowledge and thank the gentleman from Nevada for his sponsorship of the legislation. Very needed and very important. And with that, yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Yeah, I thank the gentleman from Arizona, and Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, the chairman of the subcommittee.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate all of those who have been involved in this piece of legislation, which is very important. 100 years ago, the National Park Service was established to try and help people enjoy these natural wonders. For indeed, if people are not visiting our national parks, they do not fulfill the measure of their creation. It fills no purpose. Unfortunately, in the last 100 years, it seems like there has been an attitude shift amongst many of those that are involved in our national parks and other wonders that we have, especially in the West, in which people who originally were supposed to be the reason for having these parks have now been placed last. The horrific examples of what happened at Lake Mead in Nevada is a horrible thing to take place. And were it the only example we have of these type of negative things taking place, this legislation is still well-deserved and well overdue. Unfortunately, it's not. It's just an example of significant issues that keep coming back in which our administration seems to be putting people last and doing things which are not positive and not helpful. Let me give you a couple examples. In Washington State, we have another national park in which there is an open area, almost like a community park within the national park system. And yet, the land manager in Washington decided to cancel a traditional annual church picnic because it would make too much noise for the rest of the national park. They also canceled a youth soccer tournament because it would make too much noise and disturb the rest of the national park. During our shutdown, whether indeed they were told to try and make life miserable or not, they seem to be able to do that on their own. The effort for the Park Service was to shut down the parking lot at Mount Vernon until someone had to remind them that Mount Vernon is not federal property, it's private property. At the same time, they were able to shut down a road in the Smokies to stop a school bus from making its rounds to pick up kids and taking them to school and back again. At Yellowstone, an armed guard came upon a busload of seniors to try and escort them off of the federal property, not allowing them to make any kind of stops, even for restroom breaks. At Lake Mead, at the same time, residents who were living on their private houseboats were escorted off the lake and told they could not come back. We have in this particular area the Claude Moore Farm, the restaurant over on the Blue Ridge Parkways. Even though they were private establishments, the Park Service was doing everything they could to stop people from attending those areas and allow them to make a success of those particular visits. But it doesn't happen to be just in the shutdown period. This was happening well before that time. In Alaska, on Yukon River Charlie, a private boater was stopped by the Park Service personnel, took him over to the shore, held at gunpoint, and told that he could not continue on up the river because they said he couldn't continue on up the river. The unfortunate reality is they didn't have the right to tell him he couldn't go on up the river. They were simply wrong and eventually replaced in that particular area. Other agencies of the federal government seem to be doing the same thing. We have a Wyoming rancher who did not want to give an easement to the BLM. So instead, he was threatened. They trespassed his property. They followed him and his guests. They photographed what he was doing, including his female guests who were trying to relieve themselves at the time. They were harassed and punished and told they would not have any of his permits renewed if he did not accede to the federal request. At Cape Hatteras, the Park Service went into a sue and settlement agreement, which shut down areas that had never been done before, even though the local people were opposed to that particular effort and had a devastating impact on the economy. Forest Service, unfortunately, has done the same thing with ski resorts, and in California on another ski resort where they have closed summer activities unless they renegotiate the water rights of those resorts. Or grazing permits in the West, in which they refuse to once again renew the grazing permits unless they were willing to renegotiate their water rights. All these are examples. Another minute.
I yield the gentleman 2 additional minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Which unfortunately continue to go on. What the good representative from Nevada has presented us is a terrific case in which the Park Service actually disrespected individuals, did not allow them to do what is humanitarily appropriate, and yet when they were allowed to go in there, they found these bodies. They could have overcome all of this if they just cared about people first, but they do not. Keystone Pipeline. The Park Service once again gave a comment that the Keystone Pipeline would have devastating impact on park lands that were adjacent to the Keystone Pipeline. Unfortunately, the nearest federal land, the nearest national park land to the Keystone Pipeline is 30 miles away. That's some kind of buffer zone we have. If indeed we decided that this agency, the department, and this administration were to put people first, we would have a much better relationship. Unfortunately, time after time we see where actually people are putting last and bureaucratic responsibility goes in places that is simply wrong. This bill is an example of what is happening, and it's one that should be passed here now. I appreciate that both majority and minority realize the significance of passing these pieces of legislation. I appreciate the ability of time, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, having completed our presentation and all of our speakers, I urge adoption of the bill, and I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 2166 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for
Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for the ayes and nays.
Okay, the yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1684.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 145, H.R. 1684, a bill to convey certain property to the state of Wyoming to consolidate the historic Ranch A and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis, and the gentleman from Arizona, Ms. Grijalva, will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my bill, the Ranch A Consolidation and Management Improvement Act, would convey approximately 10 acres of National Forest Service lands to the state of Wyoming to allow for consolidation and improvement of the Ranch A site. Ranch A is a historic property that was first developed in the 1930s and later came under federal ownership and was used as a fish hatchery. The property had fallen into significant neglect under federal ownership, and so the Ranch A Restoration Foundation was created, and it restores and operates Ranch A as a center for learning and interpretation of Western heritage. However, when Ranch A was conveyed to the state of Wyoming in 1997, an oversight kept 10 acres under federal ownership. The Babcock House, seen in this picture, is owned by the state of Wyoming. Now, this is in Crook County, Wyoming, very near the South Dakota border. So we're talking about the Black Hills, very, very pretty area. But the land under the house was not properly conveyed. The Forest Service testified that ownership of this isolated parcel has presented management challenges and unknown costs associated with administering the property. It is an isolated tract of 10 acres upon which this house, which is owned by the state of Wyoming, is built. H.R. 1684 would address this issue by correcting the conveyance and would also allow for the Restoration Foundation to make further improvement for the use and enjoyment of Ranch A. This bill would provide more flexibility for the use of the property, which would allow for additional revenue sources to pay for maintenance and improvement. Now, right now, these properties are leased to educational organizations for educational uses, including sometimes South Dakota State and the South Dakota School of Mines. The foundation itself has invested those monies back and raises money at fundraisers, thereby putting together approximately $1 million for facility restoration and renovation. Now, this next photo shows the deck before it was repaired and acquired by the state of Wyoming and then managed by the Ranch A Restoration Foundation. So you see the damage that occurred under federal ownership, and this is its most recent state, which indicates significant repairs. Here again, before and after the state of repair having been completed by the Ranch A Foundation using restoration funds that are obtained through the leasing operations. We're also going to look at some of the other buildings. There are numerous buildings on this property that are used primarily by South Dakota School of Mines and South Dakota State University for educational purposes. This is a very expensive repair to make, Mr. Speaker. When these lower logs rot over time because of snow and cold and dry air and then followed by rain, and they're not properly maintained, those lower logs rot, thereby causing the building to settle and creating terrible structural problems. So this is, to repair it, you have to lift the upper logs, which are not damaged, and jack the whole building up, pull the old logs out of the bottom, and reinsert new logs properly treated in order to maintain the historic finish back to its state when it was built in the 1930s. Hugely expensive, very time-consuming. The Ranch A Foundation has undertaken that under state ownership. This was the status of the repairs when the Forest Service had it, and it was used as a fish hatchery. And it's because it's an isolated property that the federal government just doesn't have the money to manage, and it wasn't even being used anymore as a fish hatchery. So the state of Wyoming, since acquiring the property from the federal government, really has improved its historic condition and its long-term viability. Now, the degraded wood has been all redone. It prevents interior damage from leakage. Every project for maintaining and renovating the lodge has to be approved under historic designation standards, because this is, we've pointed out, this is a 1930s building. It was built by the Annenbergs. It's beautiful. Going through the historic design standards is a rigorous process, and it greatly increases the cost. But it also ensures the historic integrity of the restoration. In order for the Foundation to continue to preserve their educational facilities, they need long-term revenue generation. The Foundation's academic board members and the State of Wyoming's Oversight Office of this property have supported the removal of use restrictions. With no annual appropriations in the state budget for Ranch-A, their education mission is actually harmed by limiting user fees. Ranch-A is a cultural and an education asset. My legislation will keep the ranch financially sustainable and improve its ability to serve educational users. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. H.R. 1684 would require the Forest Service to convey to the state of Wyoming 10 acres of land associated with Ranch A in the Black Hills National Forest. In 1996, Congress approved nearly all of the Ranch A to the state of Wyoming for educational purposes. We remain concerned that the enactment of this legislation will remove the requirement that this particular property continue being used for educational purposes, potentially denying public access to a valuable historic resource. It is our hope that as the bill moves forward, this concern can be addressed, and I reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further presenters or speakers on this bill, and so I will yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. And, Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yield back the balance.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming.
I, too, yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 1684? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3008 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 213, H.R. 3008, a bill to provide for the conveyance of a small parcel of National Forest System land in Los Padres National Forest in California and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
H.R. 3008 would authorize the Forest Service to exchange 5 acres of the Los Padres National Forest with the White Lotus Foundation to allow public access to their property. The surrounding topography makes the land in question the only practical access point. With no other options for access, the Foundation will be forced to cease operations. I would encourage my colleagues to support this bill, which passed the House of Representatives last Congress by a voice vote. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Los Padres Conveyance Bill is a technical fix needed to convey 5 acres of land to the White Lotus Foundation and remedy a long-standing land dispute between the Foundation and the U.S. Forest Service. The federal land in question was encroached on by a previous owner without the Foundation's knowledge. Upon discovery of the problem, the Foundation made an attempt to work with the Forest Service to remedy the situation. Unfortunately, the fix requires authorization to sell the land at a fair market value. The bill simply grants authority to the Secretary to do so. Congresswoman Capps is to be commended for her leadership on this legislation and her commitment to resolve this issue on behalf of her constituents. We support H.R. 3008 and urge its adoption and reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as she may consume to the sponsor of the legislation, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Wyoming for yielding, and to Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member DeFazio for the work that's gone on in bringing this bill to the floor today. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of my legislation, H.R. 3008. My legislation will authorize the Forest Service to convey a small parcel of land on the perimeter of the Los Padres National Forest in my district to a local nonprofit organization, the White Lotus Foundation. Over 30 years ago, the White Lotus Foundation purchased property on the border of the National Forest in the hills above Santa Barbara, California. Soon after acquiring the property, the Foundation received notice of a small encroachment onto a piece of Forest Service land that is detached from the rest of the forest. This encroachment is located on the only road that allows White Lotus and the public access to and from the Foundation's property. Due to the steep topography of the area, there are no other reasonable alternatives that would retain public access to the facility. One piece of the encroachment lies on flat ground, but this holds the equipment for fire and flood emergencies and provides access to a water pump and other necessary equipment. There are no other viable areas to move this equipment, so without this small piece of land, the facility would be forced to close its doors. While White Lotus and the Forest Service have spent several years searching for an administrative solution, but have determined that legislation is the only viable way to permanently resolve this matter. My legislation simply authorizes the Forest Service to enter into a land exchange with the White Lotus Foundation for land worth no less than the appraised market value. If this land exchange does not occur within 2 years, the Forest Service will sell the small parcel of land to the Foundation at fair market value. Prior to the exchange or sale of this land, however, the Forest Service must first certify that it is in the public interest, and it can also impose additional conditions it deems appropriate. Also, it's important to note that if the land sale does go forward, it will not cost taxpayers even a single dime. The legislation requires White Lotus to pay for the land, the survey, and all administrative and related costs. There are no exemptions from NEPA or any other environmental laws, and the land in question is not protected wilderness or any other specifically designated area. This is a straightforward bill to provide a reasonable solution to the White Lotus Foundation and the Forest Service. In fact, nearly identical legislation sponsored by our former Republican colleague Elton Gallegly passed this House unanimously last Congress. The area is now in my congressional district, and I'm pleased to sponsor the bill this Congress. Again, I thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for bringing the bill to the floor, and I do urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Mr. Speaker, the majority party has no further presenters. Is the gentleman prepared to close?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the gentlelady from Wyoming as well. And we have no further